What if the real collapse of New York isn't happening in its skyline, but in the places no one wants to talk about anymore? What if the clearest proof that something is deeply broken isn't found in headlines or crime stats, but in entire terminals that once moved millions of people and now sit half-empty, ignored, or quietly decaying? This is the question nobody asks out loud, because once you see it, the illusion becomes impossible to sustain. New York built its identity around motion. Movement meant opportunity. Trains, terminals, airports, stations, they were not just infrastructure, they were promises. Arrive here, pass through these gates, and life would accelerate. Your future would open. But today, scattered across the city and its transportation network, there are terminals that no longer fulfill that promise. They still exist physically, but socially, psychologically, they are already dead. And that kind of death is always a warning. These forgotten New York. Terminals weren't abandoned overnight. There was no dramatic shutdown, no single disaster. Instead, there was something more unsettling. Neglect without explanation, decay without accountability, silence without urgency. Maintenance declined, services were reduced, security became inconsistent. People stopped trusting these spaces, and slowly, usage dropped. Not because demand vanished, but because the experience became hostile, stressful, and unreliable. When infrastructure starts pushing people away instead of serving them, the problem is never local. It's systemic. What makes this uncomfortable is that terminals are supposed to be neutral. They're meant to work regardless of politics, wealth, or status. When they fail, they expose truths the city would rather hide. They reveal how priorities have shifted, how investment has been redirected, and how human experience has been downgraded. A glossy city can still exist on billboards and streaming shows while its connective tissue quietly rots. There's also a psychological layer that rarely gets discussed. Passing through a decaying terminal sends a message before a single word is spoken. It tells workers they are disposable. It tells residents that inconvenience is now normal. It tells visitors that the world-class city narrative is conditional and fragile. Over time, people internalize this. Expectations drop. Frustration becomes routine. The abnormal becomes familiar. And that normalization is how decline hides in plain sight. These spaces matter because they sit at the edges of everyday life. They are thresholds. When thresholds deteriorate, everything beyond them feels heavier. Commutes stretch longer. Stress rises earlier in the day. Trust in systems erodes quietly, and the city doesn't collapse in flames. It slowly convinces its people to accept less, demand less, and expect less. The most dangerous part is that no one announces this shift. There's no press conference saying, "This terminal no longer matters." It just fades. And when multiple terminals follow the same pattern, it stops being coincidence. It becomes a signal, one that suggests the decline of New York isn't theoretical or future tense. It's already embedded in the spaces people are supposed to move through without thinking. Before we even name these terminals, before we break down what happened to each one, there's a more unsettling realization forming. If the gateways of the city are failing, what does that say about everything they're connected to? Before we go any further, pause for a second and really sit with what you're hearing. This isn't about nostalgia or aesthetic decay. It's about how systems fail quietly and how people are trained to accept it without resistance. If you've ever passed through a station, an airport, or a terminal and felt something was off but couldn't quite explain why, that reaction matters. Understanding these signals is how you stop mistaking decline for normal life. If this perspective is already shifting how you see New York, or cities in general, let me know in the comments. Write "I see it now" if this resonates with your own experience. And if you believe more people need to understand what's really happening beneath the surface of modern cities, leave a like and subscribe. This channel exists to unpack what glossy marketing and statistics refuse to explain. These forgotten terminals aren't random failures or isolated mistakes. They are mirrors. They reflect the deeper condition of New York in a way no skyline photo ever could. Skyscrapers still rise, luxury condos still advertise views and status, but the spaces designed for everyone tell a very different story. When a terminal empties out, it isn't because the city lacks people. It's because the system no longer serves them with dignity, reliability, or care. Terminals are where the myth meets friction. They're where daily life collides with reality. Missed connections, broken escalators, inconsistent schedules, security that feels both excessive and ineffective. Over time, people adapt. They avoid certain routes. They arrive earlier than necessary. They brace themselves before entering. And that behavioral shift is critical because it shows loss of trust. Once people stop trusting shared infrastructure, the social contract begins to fracture quietly. What's striking is how visible this decay is, and yet how rarely it's acknowledged. These spaces don't disappear. They remain open, partially functioning, just alive enough to avoid headlines. That limbo state is the most revealing. It allows officials to claim functionality, while users experience dysfunction. The terminal becomes a symbol of institutional denial, technically operating socially abandoned. There's also an economic illusion at play. The city continues to market itself as efficient, global, unstoppable. But terminals operate on the margins of profit logic. They serve workers, commuters, service staff, the backbone of urban life. When investment flows away from them, it's a signal that human movement no longer matters as much as financial movement. Capital circulates freely while people navigate bottlenecks, delays, and stress. Emotionally, these spaces drain people before their day even begins. A decaying terminal erodes patience, raises cortisol, and reshapes expectations. You stop demanding better. You start planning around failure. That's how decline embeds itself into daily psychology. Not with catastrophe, but with repetition. And here's the uncomfortable truth. When multiple terminals reflect the same pattern, the mirror is no longer local, it's systemic. It suggests that what's breaking isn't a station or a route or a budget line. It's the urban promise itself. Every great city reveals its true condition at its entrances. And in New York, those entrances no longer feel like gateways. They feel like warnings. Terminals were once designed to absorb pressure, organize movement, and create a sense of arrival. Today, many of them do the opposite. They disorient, exhaust, and overwhelm before people even reach their destination. And that shift matters more than most realize. When a terminal begins to fail, it doesn't announce collapse. It starts subtly. Signage becomes confusing. Platforms feel cramped. Lighting deteriorates. Schedules stop matching reality. The experience grows unpredictable. And unpredictability is poison to urban life. It forces people into constant hypervigilance, turning routine travel into a low-grade stress event repeated daily. What's critical here is that terminals sit upstream from everything else. They shape how people enter the city, how workers arrive at jobs, how visitors form first impressions, and how residents measure whether the city is still working for them. When these spaces degrade, the damage ripples outward. Productivity drops. Tempers shorten, small conflicts increase. Trust in public systems erodes one commute at a time. There's also a power dynamic embedded in this decay. When infrastructure is reliable, people feel respected. When it's neglected, people feel disposable. Long waits, broken systems, and overcrowded platforms communicate a silent message. Your time doesn't matter. And when millions of people receive that message repeatedly, the psychological cost compounds. The city becomes something to endure, not participate in. What makes New York's case especially revealing is that this isn't happening at the margins. These terminals serve core routes, essential workers, and critical connections. Their decline suggests a city that has deprioritized functionality in favor of image. As long as the skyline photographs well, the entry points can quietly fail. As long as tourists still arrive, the experience of arrival itself becomes irrelevant. And that's where the illusion begins to crack. Because when the door to a system is broken, it tells you everything about what's happening inside. These terminals aren't just logistical failures. They are diagnostic tools. They expose how pressure is being redistributed downward onto users, onto workers, onto everyday life. Over time, people adapt in unhealthy ways. They leave earlier. They build extra buffers. They accept inefficiency as fate. But adaptation doesn't mean success. It means resignation. And resignation is the soil where long-term urban decline grows unnoticed. If the first thing you encounter when entering a city feels chaotic, neglected, or hostile, the message is already clear. The collapse doesn't start downtown. It starts at the door. What looks like neglect is often mistaken for incompetence, but in many cases it follows a pattern that's far more deliberate. When terminals are allowed to deteriorate slowly, without dramatic closures or public explanations, they enter a gray zone where abandonment becomes invisible. This is how decay is managed in modern cities, not through collapse, but through controlled neglect. And New York has perfected this method. A terminal doesn't need to be shut down to stop serving people. It only needs to become uncomfortable enough that users gradually disappear on their own. Fewer staff, fewer services, longer delays, poor lighting, confusing layouts, nothing catastrophic, just enough friction to make every trip exhausting. Over time, people reroute their lives around these spaces, and officials can later claim the terminal lost relevance, or no longer meets demand. The decline becomes self-justifying. This is where abandonment turns into strategy. Once usage drops, investment becomes harder to defend. Budgets are redirected. Maintenance is postponed again. And eventually, the same voices that allowed the decay point to the emptiness as proof that the space no longer matters. The terminal isn't killed, it's starved, and starvation leaves no fingerprints. This process reveals a deeper shift in how cities value infrastructure. The goal is no longer universal access or long-term resilience. It's flexibility for capital and convenience for those who can afford alternatives. Ride-hailing apps, private shuttles, premium services, they thrive as public systems weaken. The city doesn't officially replace infrastructure. It lets the market fragment it. For everyday users, this creates a quiet sense of betrayal. People remember when these terminals worked. They remember when arrival felt organized, predictable, even dignified. Watching that functionality fade without explanation produces a specific kind of frustration, not anger, but fatigue. And fatigue is dangerous because tired people stop demanding accountability. There's also a social consequence that rarely enters the conversation. As terminals decline, the people who continue using them are often those with the fewest alternatives. Lower-income workers, service employees, night shift commuters. Decay concentrates inconvenience onto specific groups, turning infrastructure into an amplifier of inequality. The city doesn't exclude directly. It designs conditions that push certain lives to the margins. And because this abandonment happens slowly, it avoids political urgency. No ribbon cutting, no outrage cycle, no scandal. Just a steady erosion of standards. The terminal remains open enough to claim success, broken enough to signal surrender. This limbo state is where modern urban decline hides most effectively. Once you recognize this pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee. These terminals aren't forgotten by accident. They are forgotten by design. Because forgetting is cheaper than fixing, and silence is safer than reform. At a certain point, the failure of infrastructure stops feeling shocking and starts feeling routine. That's when the real damage sets in. In New York, many of these forgotten terminals no longer trigger outrage because users have been conditioned to expect dysfunction. Missed connections, broken elevators, overcrowded platforms, delayed announcements. None of this feels like a crisis anymore. It feels like the cost of existing in the city. And that psychological shift is one of the clearest markers of urban decline. When people enter a terminal already assuming something will go wrong, the system has already failed at a deeper level. Infrastructure isn't just steel and concrete, it's an agreement between the city and its residents. You give your time, your labor, your taxes, and in return, the city is supposed to function. Once that agreement breaks, people don't protest immediately. They adapt. And adaptation is quieter than resistance. This normalization of chaos changes behavior in subtle but powerful ways. People arrive excessively early, sacrificing personal time just to buffer against failure. They avoid certain terminals entirely, even if it means longer routes or higher costs. They become emotionally detached from public space, treating it as hostile territory rather than shared ground. Over time, this erodes any sense of collective ownership. The terminal no longer feels like ours. It feels like something to survive. What's rarely discussed is how this constant low-grade stress accumulates. A single bad commute is forgettable. Hundreds of them reshape a person's nervous system. Cortisol spikes become routine. Irritability increases. Empathy drops. The city starts to feel aggressive even when no one is actively being violent. This is how urban environments exhaust people without ever announcing that they're doing so. And here's the crucial contradiction. While users lower their expectations, the city continues to raise its self-image. Marketing campaigns talk about resilience, innovation, world-class status. But resilience shouldn't mean tolerance for dysfunction. When survival is rebranded as strength, decline gets reframed as character. And that reframing protects systems from accountability. There's also a generational impact unfolding quietly. Newer residents and younger workers never experience these terminals functioning properly. For them, dysfunction is the baseline. They don't know what was lost, so they don't demand it back. This is how decline becomes permanent, not through destruction, but through memory loss. The most dangerous part of all of this is how reasonable it starts to sound. That's just New York. It's always been like that. What do you expect from a city this big? These phrases act like anesthetics. They numb people to the fact that something essential has gone wrong. A city should challenge you intellectually and culturally, not wear you down logistically. When chaos becomes normal, the system no longer needs to hide its failures. The users do it for them. And once that happens, the cost isn't just inconvenience. It's the quiet erosion of what people believe a city owes them and what they're allowed to expect from the place they call home. Infrastructure doesn't just move people. It communicates values. And in New York, the condition of its terminals, airports, and transit hubs has started to communicate something deeply unsettling. These places were once designed to absorb pressure, to organize complexity, to signal competence. Today, many of them do the opposite. They feel strained, understaffed, overstimulated, and brittle. And that fragility isn't cosmetic. It's diagnostic. Airports and major terminals function as stress tests for a city. They concentrate volume, diversity, urgency, and emotion into a single environment. When systems are healthy, that pressure is managed quietly and efficiently. When systems are decaying, the cracks show immediately. Long security lines that feel unmanaged rather than busy. Gate changes announced too late. Crowds with no clear flow. Workers visibly overwhelmed. These aren't isolated inconveniences. They're symptoms of a system operating beyond its capacity with no margin left. What's revealing is how often these failures are framed as temporary or exceptional. Weather, staffing shortages, technical issues. But when disruption becomes constant, explanation becomes avoidance. The truth is simpler and more uncomfortable. Maintenance has been deferred too long, investment has been misallocated, and resilience has been traded for short-term efficiency. The result is infrastructure that still functions on paper but collapses under real-world conditions. There's also a symbolic weight to airports and terminals that cities underestimate. These are the first and last spaces people experience. They shape memory. When arrival feels chaotic and departure feels exhausting, the city embeds itself as stressful, even if the skyline still impresses. Visitors may not articulate it clearly, but they feel it. Residents internalize it even more deeply. The city stops feeling welcoming. It feels transactional. Another layer often ignored is how these systems treat labor. Workers in terminals and airports absorb the consequences of systemic failure firsthand. They manage frustrated crowds, compensate for broken processes, and become the human buffer between institutional neglect and public anger. Over time, burnout rises, turnover increases, and institutional knowledge evaporates. The system becomes even weaker, accelerating the cycle. These spaces are also where inequality becomes impossible to ignore. Premium lounges, expedited lines, private transfers all exist alongside failing public corridors. The message is clear. Functionality is available, but only at a price. Infrastructure no longer unites the city, it stratifies it. Movement itself becomes a class marker. When airports and terminals begin to feel like warnings rather than gateways, the city is telling you something important. Not about travel, but about governance, about priorities, about who the city is still designed to serve, and who it has quietly stopped caring about. And if the places meant to handle arrival, departure, and transition are this fragile, the question that follows is unavoidable. What happens to the neighborhoods and communities that depend on them every single day? The most dangerous form of collapse is the one that never announces itself. It doesn't arrive with sirens or headlines. It seeps in slowly, reshaping daily life until dysfunction feels ordinary. In New York, this kind of collapse is no longer theoretical. It's procedural. And forgotten terminals are one of its clearest expressions. What's happening isn't an explosion. It's a bleed. Services thin out, response times stretch. Cleanliness declines, enforcement becomes inconsistent, small rule breaking turns into tolerated behavior, then into expected behavior, and eventually into a new baseline. None of this feels dramatic in isolation, but together, it creates an environment where order exists only on paper. In these terminals, you can feel it in the body language. People avoid eye contact. They move faster, guarded. Tension sits just under the surface. Everyone is bracing for something. A delay, a confrontation, a breakdown, even if nothing actually happens. This constant anticipation of friction is exhausting. It drains trust, not just in the space, but in the city itself. What makes this process so effective at hiding is that it spreads responsibility thin. No single failure is big enough to demand accountability. No one moment feels catastrophic. So the system never triggers reform, only coping mechanisms. And coping, over time, replaces expectation. People stop asking whether things should work better. They ask how to survive them instead. There's a social cost unfolding here that doesn't show up in reports. When public spaces feel unsafe, unreliable, or degrading, people retreat. They interact less. They isolate more. Community weakens. Shared norms dissolve. The terminal stops being a place of connection and becomes a zone of avoidance. And once enough public spaces transform this way, the city's social fabric begins to thin. This is how decline embeds itself without resistance, not by force, but by fatigue, not by chaos, but by repetition. People don't leave because one day was unbearable. They leave because every day became just a little heavier than the last. And perhaps the most unsettling part is how familiar this all feels to people who live there. When collapse becomes gradual, it becomes invisible to those inside it. Only outsiders, or those on the verge of leaving, still notice how abnormal it is. If a city is defined by how it moves, how it gathers, and how it maintains order in shared spaces, then what do these terminals tell us about where New York is headed and who it's willing to lose along the way? Tourism is often treated as a separate layer of the city, almost insulated from everyday reality. But that separation is an illusion. Visitors experience cities through the same entry points, the same terminals, the same systems, just without the long-term emotional conditioning that residents develop. And that's exactly why tourists have become some of the most honest witnesses to New York's decline. When a visitor arrives expecting efficiency, grandeur, and order, the shock is immediate. Confusing layouts, overcrowded corridors, staff stretched thin, facilities that feel worn, chaotic, or neglected. Locals may shrug and say, "That's just how it is." Tourists don't. They feel the contrast instantly because they're comparing the marketing narrative to the lived experience in real time. And that gap is widening. What's changed in recent years is that visitors no longer keep this perception to themselves. They document it. Airports, terminals, and transit failures are filmed, photographed, and uploaded within minutes. Long waits, disorder, stress, and visible decay become part of the city's digital footprint. The myth doesn't collapse through reports. It erodes through first-hand testimony. This matters because tourism has always been one of New York's strongest narrative shields. As long as people kept coming, the city could claim success. But now, many visitors arrive enthusiastic and leave unsettled. Not because the city lacks attractions, but because the basic experience feels hostile and exhausting. The glamour survives, but it's surrounded by friction. There's also an emotional detail worth paying attention to. Tourists often sense tension before they can explain it. The hurried movements, the guarded expressions, the lack of patience in shared spaces. These are signals of a city under strain. They don't make it into brochures, but they shape memory, and memory determines reputation. In this way, terminals become accidental truth-tellers. They are the first place visitors realize that New York isn't struggling in theory. It's struggling in practice. The city still sells ambition, but it delivers anxiety. And that mismatch doesn't stay hidden for long in a hyper-connected world. For residents, this creates a strange reversal. Outsiders begin naming problems locals have learned to ignore. Videos and comments echo what people feel but rarely say out loud. And that external validation can be destabilizing. It forces a reckoning. If even short-term visitors feel the strain, what does that say about the long-term cost of staying? When decline becomes visible, the next question is always the same. Why does everyone pretend not to see it? In New York, the answer isn't ignorance, it's denial. A collective, carefully maintained denial that protects identity, status, and the mythology of success tied to the city itself. Admitting that core systems are failing feels to many like admitting personal failure. So silence becomes the safer option. For decades, New York has been sold not just as a place, but as a badge. Living there meant you were tough, capable, ambitious. Enduring discomfort became a form of social capital. Long commutes, cramped spaces, high costs. These weren't problems. They were proof you belonged. That mindset makes decline uniquely difficult to confront. When hardship is reframed as character building, dysfunction gets moral cover. Institutions benefit from this silence. As long as residents internalize failure as personal rather than systemic, pressure never builds. Complaints fragment, responsibility dissolves. Infrastructure problems become background noise instead of political emergencies. And because the city never stops working completely, officials can point to movement and claim success, even as quality collapses. There's also fear beneath the denial. Fear that acknowledging decline will accelerate it. Fear that speaking openly will devalue property, careers, reputations. Fear of becoming that city everyone stops believing in. So people choose optimism theater over honesty. They repeat narratives of resilience while adjusting their lives around malfunction. Psychologically, this creates a split reality. Privately, people complain, joke darkly, vent to friends. Publicly, they downplay, defend, rationalize. Over time, that split becomes exhausting. It takes energy to maintain a story that no longer matches experience, and that exhaustion compounds the very stress the city produces. The result is normalization at scale. Terminals fail, systems degrade, and no collective demand for repair emerges. Not because people don't care, but because caring feels risky. Silence feels safer. And silence is exactly what allows slow collapse to proceed uninterrupted. What makes this moment different is that denial is starting to crack from the outside. Visitors notice, videos circulate, comparisons get made. And once a city's problems are named by outsiders, the internal story becomes harder to maintain. If denial has been the shield protecting New York's image, the question now is whether that shield can survive sustained exposure. Because when enough people stop pretending, collapse doesn't accelerate. It finally becomes visible. When you line up all the signals, the forgotten terminals, the decaying gateways, the normalized chaos, the silent abandonment, the collective denial, a larger pattern comes into focus. These aren't random failures scattered across New York. They are previews, early warnings of where the city is heading if nothing fundamentally changes. And what they suggest is uncomfortable. The decline is no longer reversible through cosmetic fixes. Cities like New York operate as prototypes. What breaks there rarely stays there. High density, extreme costs, aging infrastructure, and institutional inertia combine to create stress conditions that other cities haven't reached yet. That's why what's happening in these terminals matters beyond the city itself. They are testing grounds for the future of urban life under pressure. The most telling detail is that the systems haven't collapsed completely. They still function, just barely. Trains run, planes land, people move. But everything operates with no margin. One disruption cascades into many. One failure exposes dozens of dependencies. This is what late-stage fragility looks like. A system that survives not because it's strong, but because people keep absorbing the shock. And that absorption has limits. Over time, residents adapt by leaving, rerouting, or disengaging. Workers burn out. Trust dissolves. The city doesn't empty overnight. It hollows. The people most able to leave do. The people least able to absorb friction remain. Inequality deepens, not through policy announcements, but through infrastructure decay. What's perhaps most revealing is how little imagination remains at the institutional level. Solutions offered are incremental, temporary, reactive. Patchwork repairs for structural problems. Announcements without timelines. Promises without accountability. This isn't a city planning for renewal. It's a city managing decline carefully enough to avoid, panic. And here's the final warning embedded in these terminals. Once gateways fail, recovery becomes exponentially harder. Gateways shape perception, trust, and flow. If they feel broken, everything beyond them feels compromised. At that point, the city's reputation begins to erode faster than its buildings ever could. New York has always survived on belief in opportunity, momentum, and reinvention. But belief requires evidence. And when the evidence at the city's doors tells a different story, belief becomes fragile. The question isn't whether New York can survive this phase. It's whether it's willing to confront what these forgotten terminals are already saying out loud, before the silence turns permanent. If you stayed until the end of this video, it means you felt that something here goes deeper than abandoned terminals or broken infrastructure. It means you understand that what's collapsing isn't just concrete. It's a promise, a system, a way of life that was sold as inevitable success. And that awareness matters. If this video helped you see New York, or modern cities in general, with clearer eyes, subscribe to the channel. This space exists to expose what's hidden behind glossy narratives and to question what we've been taught to accept as normal. Leave a like if you believe these conversations are necessary. It tells the algorithm that this truth deserves to circulate. And I want you to leave a comment with this exact phrase. The decline was hidden in plain sight. That comment isn't for me. It's a signal that you're paying attention. Now don't stop here. The next video appearing on your screen goes even deeper into how urban systems fail quietly and how people are pushed out without ever being told they're no longer welcome. Watch it. Because once you see these patterns, you can't unsee them.